And we're live.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rafi Santo. I'm a doctoral candidate in the learning sciences at Indiana University. And I'm here with my co-lead for this first unit of the DML Commons Design Research Strand. Dixie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Dixie Ching. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Educational Communication and Technology program at NYU.
And this is the kickoff unit, as I said, for the Design Research Strand of DML Commons. And we'll be going for the next 8 weeks with 4 units. This unit focusing on the introduction to design-based research, where we'll be talking about the purposes and what we call the argumentative grammar of DBR. The second unit is going to focus on issues of co-design and collaboration in DBR. The third, making visible the struggles of research in DBR, and the fourth is sort of focused on critiques. You're doing it wrong, critiques of design-based research in the field. So for right now, this particular unit, we're going to focus just on giving an overview, talking about kind of what DBR is, how it sort of sits within the context of larger modes of inquiry in educational research, what its kind of purposes are, and a little bit of the history. And we have today with us a great special guest, Dr. Bill Penuel, who's a professor at CU-Boulder and in the learning sciences there. And he's going to kind of be our sort of expert scholar as we explore this introductory space of DBR. There are a couple of spaces that we'll be referring to throughout, and we'll be going through those after on the more logistical side. But Bill, why don't you start off by just introducing yourself a little bit so people can get to know you?
Sure. My name is Bill Penuel, and I'm a professor of educational psychology and learning sciences here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm really pleased to be here today with you because I've been doing design research for a number of years now. And actually last semester just taught a class on design research with my colleague Eve Mans here at CU-Boulder, who will be part of these sessions as well. Much of my work takes place in schools, but I'm also a member of this DML community and very active in studying out-of-school learning and interest-related learning as part of the Connected Research Learning Network, Connected Learning Research Network. So I really hope that I can answer questions today that arise for folks who are working both in the formal space and in the informal education space, and also working to connect different settings of learning today.
Great, thanks, Bill. So today we're going to have a pretty open conversation. We've got a couple of open activities that Bill's going to facilitate, but throughout we'll be looking for people to contribute, add thoughts, add questions, get involved. We'll be using a couple of spaces to coordinate our ideas and our conversation in addition to this live video stream. Dixie, do you want to share where people can go to participate?
Sure. So our primary place to sort of collaborate is our Etherpad. You should see a link to it. If you're watching the live stream, it should be right below that. The URL is etherpad.mozilla.org/DML Commons Unit 1 DBR. I don't know if that was helpful at all. But on the Etherpad, you can see who else is participating, the agenda, and you can also type in questions for Bill and comments and post resources. So please join us there. And then we're also going to be monitoring the Twitter stream. And if you could just use our hashtag, DML Commons, that'd be great. And I will try to monitor that and add any questions I see there onto our Etherpad.
Great. And please do, as you pop into the Etherpad, add your name to the roll call with your affiliations. I think one of the things that's really nice about some of these tools is that we can really see who's in the conversation with us and have a sense of where we're all coming from. So as people do that, and we'll kind of give a little bit of a minute for people to pop in, get situated there. we do have a kind of a little bit of an opening activity. I'll pass it over to Bill, and people can start to get engaged with that activity just as they're coming in and getting settled.
Right, and this activity will require you to go over to the Etherpad, and if you look at line 76, you will find a little fun quiz to take. So I think Rafi found this and posted it on social media, and he and I both took this little quiz, and we thought it actually might be a little fun to try today and to have as an opening activity for today. So it's a little silly, but if we're designing together, we have to be a little silly from time to time. So there's a link there in the Etherpad, if you look right on line 77 of the Etherpad, that you can just click through. And if you feel so called, you can squeeze in your answers that you got into the Etherpad in between, sort of in line 78, 79. You can practice using the Etherpad. And so we'll give maybe 2 or 3 minutes for people to try that out.
So as people are just clicking through on it and seeing these silly questions, do you want to just say something about why we thought this was relevant or interesting at all to this conversation? Why we're sort of opening with it?
Yeah, so I think you'll see that. Well, for one, it's very curious because it's a lot of what you wind up with is identifying with a particular scholar or activist in the community. But I think one of the reasons we're leading with it is I think that this little quiz gets at people sort of, you know, what's your root affect or your affective, the values and the affect that you bring to research? What are you sort of inclined toward to in your research? I think that's a really big part of developing a research identity, is kind of knowing your proclivities. You know, are you at core somebody who's always seeking to design and intervene in some way? Are you do you really come at how do you come at the world of your scholarship, for example? So I think that's why we wanted to begin here.
I know that when we both took it separately, we both got Jane Addams. I actually wasn't so familiar with Jane Addams' work, interestingly enough, even though I'm actually from New York, and that's where she did the bulk of her work in the settlement houses. Do you know much about her, Bill?
I don't. I know who she is, and that was the basis of her work. But I knew some of the other scholars better that I could have gotten. But
right. You've got outcomes like Foucault and Francis Bacon. And I'm not sure if Derrida was in there. There's a number of different critical theorists that came up, some feminist theorists. Habermas, I believe, was one. So each of these sort of indexing different ways of thinking about knowledge and also what its usage and maybe purposes are.
Yeah. I definitely found that the questions it asked me, certainly things that I thought about and could answer fairly easily. I'm curious how easy these are for people to answer too. So. The other thing to do, I guess we can sort of start to filter down into the second part once you've taken this little quiz and clicked through. If you've done that, and is to go down to line 90, and there's a set of questions about the questions. If you have some burning questions about the 4 big questions that might be related to different modes of inquiry. I don't want to assume people have read the article that we sent out about modes of inquiry in EdPsych and Learning Sciences, but if you did, you'll notice that chapter is organized around 4 big questions about what kinds of claims different modes of inquiry can support, who the audiences are for these claims, the form and substance of different arguments in that mode of inquiry, and the scope and limitations of particular modes of inquiry. So that's it'd be helpful if you have specific burning questions within the questions. Please write those down in the Etherpad as well. We're getting quite a few Jane Addams.
Mm-hmm.
You may be in the right place for design research.
Very, very shocking. Very shocking.
Yeah.
So yeah, of course, as Bill said, feel free to add any questions that you have about DBR generally, as well as about these kind of 4 questions that we're looking at. And those 4 questions are, they're questions that you, Bill, and Ken Frank posed at the beginning of an article that looked at different kind of methodologies and modes of inquiry around learning and educational research, where you kind of looked into DBR and randomized control trials and things like new techniques like data mining, learning across settings research, which is something that Dixie focuses on within our work in Hive Research Lab. And these questions are what kinds of claims can the mode of inquiry support? Who are the audiences for these claims? What's the form and substance of arguments in this mode of inquiry? And we'll be talking about that in terms of this argumentative grammar of DBR. What are the scope and some limitations of this mode of inquiry? And I love these questions because it sort of has us, it articulates for us stuff that we should always be doing around methodology, which is asking, where does this sit? To what ends? When do I use this? I think most folks in the educational research world don't just use one research method. They use a lot of different modes of inquiry, different tools in their toolbox. That's a metaphor I hear a lot when I talk to educational researchers about methodology. They have a toolbox, and how do you decide to take out a wrench versus a hammer versus a microscope, in your toolbox, and what can any of those tools do? Do you have any reflections on those, Bill, on those questions?
Yeah, I think we came up with this as a way to organize different forms of inquiry with the intention of this being something that's kind of an introduction for different methods that an educational psychologist or learning scientist might use. And the other thing I would add to what you said, Rafi, is that it helps us get beyond the platitude that, well, every research method or approach has its strengths and limitations, and gives us a way to actually think about what those strengths and limitations are potentially. And as I'll say a little bit later, I think also they are the contours of an argumentative grammar. So we've got a lot of Jane Addams, some Patricia Hill Collins. That's great. I think feminist standpoint theory is a really important, great resource for design research, especially when you're doing participatory design. It's so valuable. That's great. Some Habermas de Saussure, other ones I'm looking for, and Foucault. It's terrific. So if you haven't already, move down and pose some questions, and we're going to get going in maybe another minute. Does that sound about right, Rafi?
Yeah.
Okay. And feel free to keep adding. I mean, part of having the Etherpad in the background is that you can keep adding to it. You can come back up to what's now on line 102, a set of questions, questions about questions. And we'll do our best to try to, I'll do my best to try to monitor those as I respond to Rafi and Dixie here, too.
Yeah, and really this opening on reflecting on these questions, it's very much just an invitation for us to know what people are interested in and what people want to know about. We don't want to assume too much or too little about what people already know about design-based research, what kind of different disciplines they might be coming from, ways of thinking about what it means, what those two words separately and together of design and research kind of even imply. So this will also be really helpful for us if you can put things in to let us know how to guide the conversation in a way that's really productive and most interesting for the folks that are wanting to engage in this design research strand. And hopefully it can also be used by some of the future unit organizers to get a sense of, what discussion should we be having? We kind of came in and designed these units over the course of these 8 weeks, based on a lot of different people from a lot of different universities that were interested in design research, but also now we're in conversation with you and want to be able to be responsive. So definitely please let us know what you want to know.
And it's definitely a course for beginners too. I think for people who are really new to DBR, I would encourage you to read the readings that we've selected too. I think they'll enrich the experience. It takes often multiple passes through these readings and through discussions to, I think, develop a good understanding of DBR and to appreciate how it's itself an evolving approach to research too.
So I'm seeing some questions in the Etherpad about interest in the limitations identified and criticism leveraged. We maybe will touch on that in some small way today, but we have a whole 2-week unit dedicated to it in the last unit of the course, probably 6 weeks out from now, or maybe 7 weeks out from now. So definitely stay tuned for that. Are there other stuff you're seeing in there, Bill, that you want to address now, or is this maybe a good?
I think that's a good segue. I want to be sure to come out about how the questions are generated, because that is one of those things that I think differentiates different forms of DBR. But hopefully we'll get to talk to that today.
Great. So for right now, we're going to dive in, and Dixie and I are going to volley back and forth with some questions for you, Bill. But definitely, as questions come up, as we talk and comments come up, pop them into the Etherpad, put them onto the hashtag on Twitter, hashtag DMLCommons, and we'll aim to either integrate them throughout our conversation or we also have dedicated time after some of the stuff that we've planned to talk about for just kind of open questions for Bill from folks that are participating. But maybe as a good place to start is just, sort of like what is DBR and why? What are the things it's trying to achieve? What are the goals and purposes of DBR?
Right. So in terms of what it is, I think one of the things that makes it different from a lot of other forms of research is that it's doing design as a way to learn about learning and combining the activities, as the name suggests, of designing and research. So studying learning and the means of supporting it. But also what you're doing is you're actually engineering those means of support that you're studying at the same time. So like a randomized control trial that studies interventions, design research studies interventions. But it's not something where we take something that's already developed and study how it impacts a given learning outcome. Because oftentimes one of the main purposes for design research, I would say, is to actually develop innovations in order to learn what's possible for kids to learn. So someone might engineer develop a new kind of technology that enables students to learn a concept at an earlier age, like rates of change, or something that's like an almost advanced calculus idea, but try to do it in middle school, for example. So to try to actually take up what Brunner says, Brunner's claimed that almost anything, you can teach a young person almost anything, but you have to think about what are the means of support for that young person that might be required given where they are in their development, given the kinds of instructional experiences they've had. So this designing what's possible or trying to explore or figure out what's possible is one of the purposes of design research. But design research also can serve many other theories, many other kinds of purposes. One is to develop theory, specifically theories of how to support certain forms of learning by designing and testing particular supports in classrooms. And when I say supports, those supports can be tasks that students do together or alone. They can be instructional sequences guided by a teacher. They can be curriculum materials. They can be technology-supported learning environments. So it can be any number of a variety of supports. But the idea is that we're actually trying to aim to develop theory to get a better understanding of how to support or engineer certain forms of learning.
So, Bill, it's maybe a good way to talk about that is, we know as educators and as educational researchers, this idea of scaffolding is really important. You need to scaffold learning in some way, but that's not not useful on the design level. That's too broad in a certain respect. What does it mean to scaffold? It sounds like part of what you're talking about is like, okay, well, in order to learn this, scaffold in this way, in this particular way. Well,
I think actually we need a couple of layers of theory. So we need that big idea of scaffolding, this idea that comes out from Vygotsky that, development or learning begins on and development begin on the social plane. They begin in interaction with others. And so that helps us to attend to the tools, to the language, to the forms of activity. But it doesn't, you're right, Rafi, it doesn't tell us what are the forms of tools need to take, what are the forms of activity. And here's where one of the goals of learning sciences and design research is to develop what might be called local instructional theories. Sometimes Paul Cobb and Andy DeSessa call them humble theories. Humble because they're not grand like theories of Piaget and Vygotsky. But they're things like, how might we help kids who are struggling with operations with fractions? What are the tools and task structures that we would need to do that? What are the tools and supports that we would need to support students in persisting through engineering design problems that are targeted around circuitry, for example? So what are some of the specific kinds of supports that we need to develop? And so our theories are much more local. But we're certainly guided by that big theory of scaffolding, right? We know we've got to have that sort of scaffold. We know we need to attend to these dimensions. So both of those layers of theory, I think, are really important. But where we're really pushing or developing in design research is at that local level, I would say.
And so that's one thing that DBR can produce is theory and kind of local specific instructional theories, disciplinary theories. What else does it produce?
Well, another kind of theory that we can develop are theories of design. So some of my students and I, particularly my student Sam Severance and I, are working on developing a better theory of how we organize collaborative design within design-based research. And what we're looking at is to what extent does that collaborative participation in collaborative design support and develop teachers' agency. So teachers historically have and are having less and less agency in terms of how they teach, what they focus on. So how can collaborative design, or how must it be organized in order to expand teachers' agency, the sense of what's possible for them to teach, the sense of being able to realize broad goals for student learning that they might have, or that their students might have, and how they can support those. So that's another layer of theory we might be focusing on. And the other thing is we're developing knowledge. So in design-based implementation research, which is really focused on developing and studying supports for implementing innovations, we may be focused on developing an understanding of what it takes to implement a particular innovation across a wide range of contexts. We might be studying the productive adaptations that teachers make to those innovations in order to develop knowledge of the range of those adaptations that actually can support, accomplish the learning outcomes that we might be collectively after.
I wonder if you can speak really briefly to just the intersections of those things that might be produced. You said, it's good for producing theory, it's good for producing designs and innovations, new actual tools, technologies, curricula, etc. It's good for producing theory around design rather than necessarily instructional theory or pedagogical theory. And then there's theory around sort of implementation and kind of on the systems level. How do those sort of intersect with you? Do you see ways that they productively work with each other? Do you see tensions between those different purposes that DBR might have?
Well, I'll talk a little bit later about some ways I think specifically that the design of innovations and developing learning theory are coupled. I would say that is a really common coupling in design research. And the last two goals I talked about, developing theories of design and maybe developing knowledge of implementation, those are things that you don't see as much of in the field of learning sciences research. I'd love to see more of it. I do think that in principle, any one of these purposes can be used in combination in the same project. But the key is actually attending to them and designing your research around them. So part of doing good design research is being intentional about what your research questions are and what your purposes are. Because you'll only be able to handle so much, especially if you're a solo investigator or even if you're a small team. Overwhelm is a pretty common experience in design research among teams. And so I don't encourage everybody to go after all four of these big purposes that I've named, developing theories of learning, developing innovations, developing theories of design, and developing knowledge around implementation supports. It's a lot. You would need a very big team to be able to do all four of those at once.
Right, yeah, and we'll talk more next week, Dixie and I, about some of the challenges that we've had, and us taking things off the table in our project to be able to say, okay, we're going to focus on this kind of production of knowledge versus that, versus another.
That's great. I applaud that. Taking things off the table is a good thing in research. Focusing, and there is an iterative process to that, Rafi. I mean, you may start pretty big, and you may focus. You may get interested in a broader range of things through what you see. That's a pretty common dynamic of design research, because it's not a form of research where you set up your questions and your methods all ahead of time and then simply carry out the research. It really requires some dynamic adjustments as you learn how your designs are playing out in a classroom or an out-of-school setting, and then you realize, wow, some new questions are emerging, and we need to both change our design and change the research questions we're answering.
Cool. And Bill, along the lines of trying not to feel too overwhelmed, it seems that it might be helpful to have a better understanding of things like the argumentative grammar of whichever mode of inquiry you choose, which feels appropriate. I was wondering if you could first talk a little bit about what argumentative grammar entails, and then maybe go into what that looks like for DBR.
Right. So this term, argumentative grammar, comes into the lexicon of design-based research around 2003, and it comes from Eamon Kelly. And what he defines an argumentative grammar as the logic that guides the use of a particular method and that supports the reasoning about its data. So importantly, an argumentative grammar is not simply about how strong the argument you make in a particular research article is. It's something that can be isolated from a particular study altogether, but it's something shared among a community of scholars and hopefully recognized by scholars outside that community too, who engage in different modes of inquiry. The argumentative grammar of random assignment studies is really based around the argumentative grammar of how random assignment helps make all these contextual variables and self-selection not threaten the conclusions you might want to draw about the causal impact of something. It's not specific to a particular random assignment study. So, it's better to think of DBR as not having a fully developed argumentative grammar yet, but rather right now it's kind of a family of approaches but I think we're also moving towards, and learning scientists have proposed, a set of standards or tools that we might be able to use to evaluate our claims. Like, how strong are our claims? How do we warrant our claims? How do we decide whether we have sufficient evidence to support different kinds of claims?
I would just want to add that that's really helpful for kind of a younger scholar entering this field to know that it's all evolving, and that it's also not even clear for folks who may be very familiar with all the different strands and the history of how they came together. So.
Right, and I think one of the things that's nice about the Salon series is it's designed to give you some folks who participate in multiple sessions to really get a flavor for some of those the critiques of the argumentative grammar that does or doesn't exist in DBR, and also tools that people have introduced to respond to them. One question specifically to make that concrete is, question is, how do we actually put our theories in harm's way? Like, how do we, actually prove ourselves wrong? Maybe we have some our intuitions about how to support learning are wrong, but how would we know? Bill Sandoval at UCLA has proposed the idea of using something called a conjecture map to help us be in design research accountable to our designs. He suggests that we need to make at the beginning a map of how our specific conjectures about how to support learning are embodied in the designs that we're creating. And if we think it's important, for example, to support student reflection and revision of their ideas, well, what specifically in our design supports that? What are we putting into play in classrooms? And when students use a tool or tasks that is supposed to support reflection or revision of student thinking, does it actually result in the kind of reflection and revision we're trying to do? And how do we hypothesize that reflection and revision supports that kind of learning in the first place that we want to see? So Sandoval says we need to make all that sort of thing explicit, and that when we conduct research on our designs, we need to look for those things that are supposed to happen and see whether they're happening or not. So this is one of those concrete tools that he suggests that we should put into play to strengthen our argumentative grammar, to put a theory in harm's way. And I would add to that, I think beyond where Sandoval has gone is I think we actually need to anticipate some ways that our designs may fail, and to actually put those into our conjecture maps so that we study them. Maybe people won't use the tool that we made, or maybe they're going to use it for a purpose we hadn't anticipated, or maybe the reflection processes that take place simply aren't powerful enough to produce the kind of learning we want. It's not always possible to imagine all of those ahead of time, and designs will fail spectacularly in ways that you can't possibly anticipate. But part of the discipline of trying not to ward against our own confirmation bias is to think ahead of time, how could we fail, and to put those in our maps.
It sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is really just intentionality. You know, one of the things that I know was a little bit challenging for me, you know, that I both in my own practice as an educational, you know, designer, educator, curriculum developer, was feeling like I was, you know, creating lots of stuff, but not really having a good sense of necessarily what I was always trying to accomplish, and sort of like the idea of your learning objectives at the beginning of a lesson. You know, how tightly are those actually tied to, you know, what do we expect to actually happen? And can we actually answer that question? So it sounds like this theme of intentionality is important while also having flexibility, of like knowing that, like, okay, we thought this, something else happened, it didn't meet our learning goals, but maybe it met some other learning goals that maybe we should actually value, and now we've got to pay attention in a totally different way than what we thought.
I think that's right, Rafi. I think one has to be intentional, one has to be flexible. I think also the process I've found in writing down my conjectures, I pay close attention to whether I believe what I'm writing down and where I think the gaps in my own logic are. And also, how can I justify this link that I'm putting in my conjecture map? For me, it's really important to go back to prior art. What have people done before? What do we already know about this? Because part of developing an argumentative grammar in learning sciences and design research is we have to build on each other's work. We can't design everything from scratch all over again every time we set out to design something. And so part of the justification for why I believe this design might produce this kind of process in the classroom, or this feature, is somebody's already been there. You know, somebody's already tried this in a context that's similar to mine, or maybe it's not similar, but I want to try it out. I want to extend it here.
So, speaking of things that have happened, like in the past, I'm wondering if it would be possible for you to share something from your, you know, extensive history of doing design research to kind of put some meat on the bones. You know, and this is just to also say, one of the things I've actually found a little bit frustrating about the DBR conversation is that there's lots of writing on almost like a theoretical methodological level where people are outlining, like, what is it about, but I see too few real nice kind of almost, you know, what Jim G might call, you know, working examples that really show us what it really looks like, and also highlight some of the messiness of it, because it all sounds so nice and clean when you read these papers.
Yeah, and I think that is a legitimate critique of the literature on design research. It certainly came up when Eve and I taught last fall, was, wait, we're supposed to be putting our theories in harm's way, but we're not seeing enough about the failures of design research. And even if people acknowledge ways that their designs didn't work out the first way that they expected, at least at the end they worked out in a good enough way. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about a project that was my first design-based research project. So it was a mess, and one reason I want to talk about it today is there's a lot of writing about it and about the different phases about it, and somewhere in the background on Twitter, from my account, which is at Bill Penuel, are some links to those that'll be happening throughout this hour, and happy to share those too more broadly. But this is a project that conducted more than a year ago, and the idea of this project, someone asking, like, where does the theory come from, or where do the questions come from? So this one is really, like a lot of my projects, I think is a blend. It came from different places. It came from the work that my center was doing, the Center for Technology and Learning at SRI International, on wireless handhelds. At that time, wireless was new. Small handheld devices were relatively new in terms of going beyond the graphing calculator. People were really excited about it as a low-cost computing device that might enable kids to collaborate with one another, engage in collaborative learning. But I was also doing some work on a study of one-to-one computing initiatives that were just getting started then, places where people were buying laptops in entire school districts and trying to figure out their potential. And I was in one district that was really focused on that as an equity strategy for them. They were a district with about half of kids living in poverty, about half the kids were African American. Big divides, both digital divides and economic and racial divides in this. And I approached them because they were really committed to equity, about going in together on a project focused on another interest of mine, which was classroom assessment. And so out of that was born a proposal to look at the potential of these classroom devices to support better classroom assessment and project-based science, and mostly in the middle grades. We partnered initially with the district, but we realized we didn't know enough, and it was all the way across the country in South Carolina. And so we began with a period of what workplace scholars call rapid ethnography, trying to get smart fast about the context. And we learned a lot from this period when we conducted some observations and interviews with people, which included both teachers, some principals, some community members. We'd hoped to build on this great tech infrastructure, the district said. That there was wireless in every building, so they said. But teachers told us almost to a T that the wireless wasn't reliable enough for them to use in their classrooms. We hoped to build on the district's solid commitment to project-based learning. We didn't see very much of that when we went into classrooms. We thought that there was this deep commitment and broad commitment to equity, but we saw an awful lot and heard an awful lot of deficit views of young people. And we learned from the Gullah community, which was a community in the Sea Islands where this was part, that there was a lot of historical tension between that community and the school district about how well their kids were being served by the community. And so we were committed to collaborative design, but we then used this information. One of the ways that I think why we need design theories here is because we need to organize our collaborative design to fit the context well. And so if we really were committed to expanding teacher agency in this process, but also in so doing providing more equitable opportunities to learn for all students, we had to think carefully about how to do that. So for one thing, we realized this tension with the district and the teachers. We had to put teachers, we had to figure out how to facilitate a way to put teachers in charge of the ideation. But we also had pulled in the community, and we held our design workshop in this historic school that had been a very significant school founded in the middle of the Civil War for newly freed African American slaves. That's where we did our design workshop. We included that organization in the process throughout to really make sure that community was represented in the design. So this was really, so we used that work to focus our work. And our teams weren't just the teachers. We had assessment experts, people with science ed background, technology experts, people who could actually facilitate design. And I'll say, one of the things that happens is we clashed a lot about the visions of what good assessment might or ought to look like. A pair of our teachers wanted us to build a flashcards tool. We said, well, that's not good assessment. And we struggled with how to engage them in thinking in both providing them what they said they wanted, but also pushing a little bit to say, well, what if you actually reverse this quizzing thing? What if you actually generated kids, use tools to generate kids' questions and talk about what kids' questions are in science class and think about which ones could be investigated. And through that process of compromise, which we've written about quite extensively about this project, that's kind of one of the things that I think happens in collaborative design. And teachers also struggled with what it meant to be a designer. And we wrote about that. Like at various points they're like, what is the point of this? What do you want me to do? They were so used to not having agency in this process of developing curriculum materials, it was hard for them to sort of really engage until halfway through our process. So, and then finally, one of the phases of this work was doing a small study where we extended the use of the tools beyond our initial collaborative teachers who've been involved in the collaborative design process. And here I'd say we entered a kind of design-based implementation research phase where the design task shifted to thinking about professional development and also helping teachers design activities that used our particular software tools in different contexts. And one of the things that one of the things we did not find in this study were huge shifts in teachers' assessment practices that we'd hoped for. It did not succeed. We did, I think, and we were able to document this in a journal article, some shifts in how they thought about the purposes of assessment, beyond just figuring out whether kids were right or wrong, and towards really trying to develop an understanding of what kids were thinking, which we thought was a modest success, but it was certainly not the success we were hoping for.
So really briefly, it sounds like you went, in terms of you mentioned those 4 purposes of DBR at the beginning, of generating theory, generating innovations in education, generating knowledge about design, generating knowledge about implementation. How would you square this project vis-a-vis those kinds of purposes and productions?
Yeah, so I'm pretty confident we did not develop anything new in the way of learning theory. In fact, we were really drawing a lot on what other people had done. We drew particularly on Bransford and Schwartz's notion of reflection. Our project was called Wireless Handhelds for Informing Reflection or Improving Reflection on Learning. So we were really thinking about how these various tools could support that process. But we were really thinking about mechanisms that we thought were fairly already well worked out. What we didn't know was how technology could provide the support for that, and whether these wireless handhelds could do that, and what that might look like. So I think we were trying to develop knowledge related to that. New theory, I'm not so sure. I do think that one of the things that was a product of this is a certain flavor or theory of collaborative design within the learning sciences. The paper that came out of that is one that people have referenced a lot and when they go back and say, how did we organize our design process? And that's, to me, the test of good theory is it used, is it picked up? And so how we conceptualize co-design in that project that came out, was something that came out of the project, and I think as a number of people have found pretty useful in thinking about organizing design on their own projects. And then lastly, I think we did develop some knowledge about conditions of adoption related to these technology-supported assessment. And so that's more on the knowledge related to implementation supports on the DBIR side of things that I think would be something I would say was a success story for that.
And part of what I'm hearing that's so great here is that because there's so many different things that can come out of DBR, these different kind of, theories, innovations, knowledge about design, knowledge about implementation, is that even if your project goes horribly, like you definitely have, there's got to be something there that you can share as valuable. And maybe part of the challenge is being able to know what is a value to share and what will be useful down the line. But maybe I think people might find it, oh well, if the innovation fails itself, then we failed. But like there's so many. I mean, how many curricula have I done that are terrible? But like, how much have I? There is so much to learn in that process. Yeah.
It's very true, and I have to say I would be remiss if I didn't say we had a big team. We were able to do this, and also I was a newbie to this. I was basically apprenticing to Jeremy Rochelle on the collaborative design piece, and he had really been somebody who had gone before. I got to work with Deb Tater on the ethnography. She had been workplace ethnography at Xerox PARC before. So she had a deep wheel well of tools that I didn't have, quite frankly. I was principally skilled in evaluation. I knew a little bit about assessment. So I had some great people to learn from and with in the process. And it's something I think is so important. And this is a learning by apprenticeship. Find somebody who does great work that you really like and appreciate, respect, and find a way to do it with them, because that's how I learned. I did not do this on my own. So
Bill, right now we're going to transition over to sort of going through the Etherpad and trying to find some good questions for you. I have one right now around design-based implementation research. Obviously, you're very much associated with that, and there was a question about whether or not you could just kind of talk a little bit about the similarities or important distinctions between DBR and DBIR. There was also a little piece in the Modes of Inquiry article around sort of how a focus on implementation may have been driven somewhat by this, by sort of the audience that DBR kind of principally spoke to, and wanting to expand, you know, that piece of being effective in the real world and all that. So
sure. So DBIR has a lot of different roots, and I think it's important to name two principal roots for that. So one that we're not talking about today but is really important is implementation research. And so there is a field of area of implementation research in education, but also in fields like political science, in social welfare research, and public health research, that the aim there is to develop knowledge and theory related to how policies are changed as they are implemented in practice. And notice that I said how policies are changed as they are implemented, because just like any design is changed through enactment, so too are policies. And so there's a rich base of knowledge and theory. Go-to people for me are folks like Jim Spillane and Cynthia Coburn, both of whom I'm fortunate to count as collaborators, who really provide us with a set of, let's call them the equivalent of local instructional theories at the implementation level. There are sets of tools we desperately need if we want to design to support implementation. But it does come out of design research, and Dixie, as you said, it comes out of critique of design research leveled by folks like Barry Fishman and Joe Kraychek in an article around what it takes to create scalable, usable curriculum design, and a realization that a lot of what we've produced in design research is really powerful, but it can't be implemented very easily, and especially within today's schools and districts. And part of what you have to do is not give up on the innovations simply because they don't work in the context as they are now. You have to build the context. You have to rebuild the context or change those contexts. So DBIR shifts our focus to designing across levels. And when I say across levels, because usually when you do that, when you shift to the focus, like what would it take for my curriculum to be able to be implemented widely and effectively in a district, I may have to change the curriculum itself, but I'm also going to have to design the professional development. I'm probably going to have to look at the district's pacing guides and change that, look at the district's interim assessments, because all those things are part of what Jim Spillane and Megan Hopkins call the instructional guidance infrastructure of a school district. They're the things that people turn to and look at when they say, am I going to teach this thing or not? And so DBIR says, look, we've got to really look at this as a system and look at how this will fit within a system. And that's a real shift from traditional DBR to make that shift.
So, it actually sounds, reflecting on that answer, that, people that are just coming to DBR, hearing about that shift might be even more anxiety producing in terms of the issues of scope and issues of like, how does one even, if you're either, a graduate student or a postdoc or just starting as an assistant professor or are an educator within an informal educational organization that has a particular orientation towards research and evaluation, like I saw this question earlier, like, do you sort of have advice for people that are interested in DBR and interested in sort of getting started on this, especially given the particular breadth that you mentioned of what DBR and now DBIR are trying to accomplish, and kind of the resources it takes of being able to have these robust teams and things like that?
Yeah. So great question, Rafi. For one, DBIR is a team-based approach, and I think it happens best within long-term research practice partnerships. So going it alone, I would say, is not even an option in DBIR. However, one can carve out a specific niche or project within a larger DBIR effort. So I mentioned my student Sam Severance, what is he doing within our project? Well, he's got a couple of roles. One is he's facilitating the collaborative design process for development of a 9th grade biology unit that's aligned to the next generation science standards. But he's also studying the collaborative design process. He studied it in our work in mathematics, and now he's studying it in science. And so he's taking a very small slice of the work that we're doing and trying to develop a better understanding about which parts of the process support the development of transformative agency among teachers in this process. And so I think one thing that's important to do is to slice off a small piece. That might be a piece related to design. It could be a piece related to implementation research and DBIR. Within DBR, I do think it's possible for folks to carve out very small but very impactful projects. A student here, Eric Dutilli, has been working with an internship program that's focused on broadening participation in STEM fields for first generation and college goers and also underrepresented groups. He's working with an organization here in town called Neon, which provides these internships. And one of the things that he's discovered after 2 years of ethnographic evaluation is, look, there's some issues with how they're recruiting folks into the program. People are constantly selecting folks who already bring the skills and are probably going to succeed and persist into STEM fields. So what his DBR project is going to be is a very small, tightly focused intervention, if you will, with the mentors who are involved in selecting the 4 or 5 interns into this program each year, in order to really look at how can you broaden their criteria so they are more focused on equity in their criteria, not simply on, I'm looking at this intern as someone who can help me do my work, but rather I'm looking at this intern as someone who I can help them develop skills while I also get some, I develop a relationship and we have something mutualistic that we're both learning from, getting out of, and also serving the broader equity and diversity goals of the organization. So that's kind of a concrete example of something that he's really going to undertake on his own, although he definitely has partners even there. It's really important DBR is a partnership approach even at the smallest scale with folks inside this organization at Neon who want him to do this work, who are excited to have him do the work, and that he's developed a relationship of trust with over 2 years.
One last question from the participants, and then we're going to sort of do a little bit of a recap and point people to some resources and some prompts for the next steps of participating in the course. That question was about how kind of DBR maybe considers itself. Jamie Gravel from UCLA, I apologize if I mispronounced it, is interested in the ways that DBR considers or doesn't consider itself sort of activist research. How would you think about it, through that lens of activism? Maybe almost linking us back to some of the first questions of epistemology that we started with.
Oh, I love that question. So I think it is always and already an activist methodology, but you will find people in our field positioned very differently with respect to whether they consider what they do activist. I consider any form of intervention research activist in the sense that it is a bet on a possible social future, and it's a bet on a desirable social future. So I think one of the things that I would love to see our field go beyond is I'm not sure design is the right metaphor for the work we do. Kevin O'Connor and I, as well as Kevin O'Connor and Annie Allen, have written about what are we doing when we design is really we're organizing access to valued social futures. And so when we use that metaphor of organizing instead, I think we start to attend explicitly to the political. I think that's a layer of theorizing about learning that we really need to improve upon. I think we also think about, well, whose valued future? We really have to foreground much more when we think about organizing. Are we designing with? Are we designing for? Who's at the table when we design? Who's at the table when we decide what problems we need to focus on? DBIR is quite explicit about, in the first 2 principles of DBIR. One is that we are focused on problems of practice from multiple stakeholders' points of view. And that multiple stakeholders piece is purposefully ambiguous to draw attention to the question of who's at the table, which I think we have to be always asking. And those will always implicate issues of power, authority, exclusion, and history. So all of those things need to be on the table when we're doing DBR. And with all of that said, I realize that some of my colleagues would not agree with my stance on that. But I think one can maybe perhaps recognize that it's always a political act, even if one is framing it explicitly as political or not, to be engaged in design.
Yeah, and I love that question of, I mean, even just asking the question of who's at the table feels to me personally like always an activist question. You know, even just asking it is drawing attention to issues of power. I think that's really great. So we're nearing the hour, and I wanted to point people to some resources, and I'll ask you, Bill, to maybe comment on why some of these resources were selected for this unit. But just so people know, if you go to the DML Commons website and you navigate to the design research strand and you click on this particular unit, at the bottom of that page, you will see a set of readings. There's 3 kind of core readings that we selected, and then a couple of like supplemental ones for people that want to dig deep, and we invite you to do so. Bill, do you want to talk about the 2 articles you selected, and I can share about the 3rd one?
Yeah, I don't have it open to look at the order. The first one is the modes of inquiry one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the content of that one today, but what that article is it's actually a review article of the different forms of inquiry that are common in design, in educational psychology, and in learning sciences. There's a section about what I take to be right now as the argumentative grammar of DBR, so you can sink in a little bit more detail to that. So that's why I included that, and I think for a lot of students too who are new to DBR, it helps them locate DBR in relation to other things they might be a little bit more familiar with. Some students might be more familiar with ethnography, for example. Other people may be familiar with intervention research as traditionally conceived in randomized controlled trials. The second piece is a lovely article by my colleague Susan Giroux with her advisor Rogers Hall and Jasmine Ma from Columbia. And one of the reasons I picked this article, even I used it in our class, is that I think it's a wonderful article to illustrate not just what DBR looks like, but in terms of the description of the methods of DBR. In terms of the product that comes out of it as a set of design principles. Susan, in her work, always does such a wonderful job of telling you more about the warrants for her claims and being very explicit. So in terms of a model of that, I think that's great. And then there's a piece that Chris Hoadley suggested, which is another example, which is a great example of technology, where what is being designed is a piece of technology called Speakeasy that is embedded in a larger body of work around supporting argumentation in science. And so that's a wonderful piece, and I think Chris will be with the group next week. Is that right?
That is, and so I'll speak about that, and I'll also speak about a couple of things that people can do between now and then if they're interested in kind of digging in. So next week, we're focusing a little more on what we call stories from the field. So Bill offered one today. Next week, Dixie and I will be sharing about Hive Research Lab and kind of where it sits as a project in this world of DBR, and Chris Hoadley, who is part of the original DesignBased Research Collective, will talk about Speakeasy, as mentioned, and those will be some nice contrasting cases of different kind of forms of DBR in practice. I think there's a couple other ways that if you want to get involved right now that might be useful. So if you look in line 153 of the Etherpad, there's some prompts and activities that we've set up for the week aside from the readings. One is this activity that we set up on collectively generating a sort of design-based research timeline, and there's a link to a separate Etherpad there that you can look to, and that is not something you need to be an expert in at all. Part of this is just collectively and collaboratively developing knowledge together. So things that you, as you're maybe doing readings, as you're aware of the history of education writ large, both theoretically or policy-wise, putting things in that you feel like sort of lead us to where we are today. I think it's really important to reflect on why did this emerge? What is the consequential history behind it, underpinning it? The second is we have a set of blog prompts for people that are linking blogs to the DML Commons. One is just to respond to the readings in any way that feels relevant to you. A second is to do something maybe a little deeper on that kind of a moment related to the history or unfolding of DBR that you want to talk to. And the last is maybe contrasting and comparing where DBR sits for you in your toolbox of methodologies, where it sits in relation to ethnography or PAR or participatory design, et cetera. So feel free to participate in any of these ways, and I know I will, and I'll be adding in various posts, and I'll be adding to the timeline, and really invite you to join me. I think part of the value of this will be those kind of collective interactions and collective knowledge production that we can engage in here. So I know we're at the hour. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank you, Bill, for sharing so much of your experience and perspective on this approach. And I want to thank the DML Hub and Kylie for kicking off the course. We're off to a good start. And Dixie, thanks so much for being an awesome co-facilitator. And we'll, I guess, see you all next week, unless there's any last comments from anybody.
Thanks all for organizing it. Thanks you guys for organizing this. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.